So we're going to focus on how we're creating depth in fur, and we're looking at a cavapoo in this particular instance. It could be a cockapoo, a cavapoo, a labradoodle, doesn't really matter, but that kind of fur. So we've already looked at how to create curly and wavy fur, so that will definitely help us in this instance. And to be honest, we have therefore already created depth because we've created wavy fur in the last lesson, but we really want to just focus on how we're creating depth. I really want us to think about specific things in each class, and it will help us progress our work much better. So I've picked this photo because we've got quite thick tufts of fur, and in between these thick tufts we need to have bits of the underpainting showing through. For cavapoos and cockapoos in particular, the fur is so thick that the actual structure of the face is distorted. I mean, they look incredibly cute, but we can't always see the exact structures that are underneath. We just get an idea of where the brow is, and there's just a pile of fur. But of course, it doesn't look like it's a dog with a microphone bobble on its head. It does still look like it has a structure underneath. The fur doesn't make the head feel particularly big, not like a chow chow dog where the fur is very smooth and thick and deep. In this instance, we can see that there is depth here, and that's what we want to create. If we don't successfully create depth, then like we talked about in the last lesson, we can end up with something very flat, like when I was talking about how people can sometimes draw fur, curly fur, as one long sort of wiggling S line. Or we can end up with the dog losing its structure altogether, and we don't get eye sockets, we don't get a snout, and the whole thing just starts to feel really confused. So it all comes back to creating depth and creating it in the right sections. So again, we're working around an eye because eyes are very tricky to get to sit into the head, but it gives us the opportunity to look at moving fur in multiple directions, which is very useful. So I'm going to start with the 177. I will need to go a little bit darker than this as well, but we want to think about nestling that eye back into the eye socket. So this sits quite nicely with the black. I am going to introduce a dark brown to help, a dark grey to help me as well. And I'll probably use the black as a blending tool, which you'll have seen me do in the past with the fox. That was the basic fur technique. Now, it wasn't basic in terms of being simple, but we weren't doing curls and tufts and also all sorts of things like we are getting into now. So this is the first instance of us creating depth here. We're creating a very dark shadow. And it's often what I see, as I've already mentioned in other tutorials, I see people missing this out quite a lot. And instead, the eye, they could make a great eye and there's nowhere for it to sit. We haven't made a shadow, we haven't made an eye socket. And the eye then ends up feeling both round and flat all at once because you're suggesting that it's an eyeball sat in the skull, and yet you've given it nothing to sit inside. So this is what we really need to create. It's a nice area of dark around that leads up to, in this instance, a brow that is partially covered by this lovely tufting fur. So again, note here how we are creating soft edges once more. In this instance, I'm using a semi-blunted pencil instead of using my pencil on the side. Now, I think for this specific image, it does make my life a little bit easier to use a semi-blunted pencil because I've got these tufts of fur that I'm already working around, just like we did with the curly fur tutorial. So I really would do these lessons sequentially, do the curly fur tutorial first, because it explains why I'm building up the underpainting in this way. Of course, the other reason I am using the pencil more on the tip than the side is simply that this pencil is getting quite short now, and it's much easier to hold it closer to the tip. As we discussed in those very early classes with the HB pencil, it's best to have your working pencil at an angle to the page instead of point down. So I'm really building up the darks. I'm going to go in with other colours soon, but we are working on the darker side of the face. So we're working on the left-hand side. So there are a lot of shadows. Again, it's an opportunity to really look at building up depth. Notice how I'm sweeping the pencil all the time to create nice soft edges as I work. And this is where we have lovely little tufts that would be coming over the snout, and that's where the study is just going to end around there. Okay, so let's return to the eye first and really make sure we get that incorporated. This is the 175, so this is the sepia dark. It's a very warm dark grey. I'm going to start to work slightly over the top of the brown and up to the edge of the black, using it like a blending tool. And then I'll work in with the black as well, just so I really get that eye to basically melt into this area. So I can definitely see I need more black. So I'm using the 199 for this drawing from Faber Castell. You see how that eye is really, as I say, it's starting to melt into that area. I've got a lot of pastel down and I'm allowing the pencil to mix all of that dust on the page so that we get some really soft transitions. And this is why I think it's possibly more useful to create swatches of fur based around a feature instead of just creating a literal swatch, because it shows you how you need to manipulate the fur, how you need to manipulate that underpainting to work in different scenarios. So I'm swapping now to the 169. So these are pencils that I've all used before. I do use other pencils, I can promise you. But we're working on similar colours for the first few classes. So we are using the same pencils, which is good because you should start to get more confident and familiar with the mixing of these colours. So again, just like we've done before, we're working out of the edges of the dark brown, the 177, and we're starting to shade over the areas of card which haven't got anything on them. And in the image, they're still in shadow. So we're looking for the reddish areas. We won't be covering up everything. We're looking for the darker points. So this is why we're going around the edge and slightly over the top of that 177. So I'm still sweeping, pencil is again semi-blunt, and I'm really thinking about that fur direction the whole time. Notice how the fur direction is changing really rapidly on this fur type. So it's something you've got to watch out for when you're doing cockapoos, cavapoos, anything like that. And if you are a pet portrait artist or an aspiring pet portrait artist, you will get a lot of commission requests for these kinds of dogs, if you're in the UK in particular, because they're so popular at the moment. So you really do want to get comfortable with this very thick, fluffy, but tufty fur. I do also have a full-length time-lapse of me drawing a dog very, very similar to this. It's not a tutorial, but it is a full-length time-lapse, and that's in the membership area in the pet portrait course. Okay, so for the lighter areas, just like we've done before, I'm taking the 182 from Faber Castell and I'm just sweeping the pencil on and off the page, and you can see it's starting to lift these areas out towards us and make them feel as though they are catching the light. Obviously, this is still the underpainting stage, so we're still focusing on big shapes, local colour, which just means a general colour of an area. And we're also thinking about blending things together to ensure we get a range of soft edges. So that's why having semi-blunt pencils or using your pencils on the side is actually really good for this stage. So you can see here I've swapped to a side grip on the pencil, just helps me cover a larger area a little bit more easily. And I'm blending over the top of the other layers a little bit, or glazing, and it's joining everything together for me. Still trying to think about the fur direction as I work. You can see I'm not getting caught up in details, but I am creating clumps here. Again, if you've done the HB lessons, you'll have already gone over the basic idea for forming clumps of fur. For this section just here, because it is in shadow, feels a little bit more grey, so I've just swapped pencils to the 180. The 180 is very similar to the 182, this golden brown I was using, but this has less yellow in it, so it's a little bit more of a neutral or flat brown. You can see how it feels dull in comparison, and therefore carries the illusion of less light. So another new pencil, the 640. This is a Stabilo Carbothello, very warm red, deep brown. I do have a pencil comparison sheet. You don't need to get all of these different pencils, so you can just use a basic range of browns. And I'm just going to add in, as we did with the fox, and that was the basic fur technique if you're wondering, I'm just going to start to add in some details at this stage now. So we're moving out of the underpainting stage and we're starting to move into individual textures. Now, I'm not thinking about this being hugely visible in the final drawing, but it's just going to give me a little bit more contrast to work with as I start to build up the other colours. So a lot of this work is not actually going to have a huge amount of individual hair details going on. It's more about shading large areas. But you can see in the photograph there are some bits where we do have these individual deep details. These can be added in again later on as well. And it just helps me start to figure out the fur direction. But for areas like this, it can also help me start to make individual clumps of fur. So I'm literally drawing around where I might make lighter areas and have clumps of fur. So if you're not quite sure what I'm babbling on about, just keep watching to see how the texture starts to come together. So it's very similar to how we did our curls. And what we're thinking about again is creating this depth. So I'm returning to my darker pencils before getting lighter to ensure that we get enough depth in here. So I'm picking up the 620 and I'm going to start to bring in the fluffy so-called details. So because we're thinking about depth, what I want you to keep in mind is that we need to retain areas of the underpainting. So I'm using my pencil semi-blunt to start to create these areas because if you have a look at the photo, unlike the curls we were creating last time, the curls or clumps, however you want to word it, of fur that we're making, they have fewer individual hairs that can be seen. We can still obviously see small individual hairs, but the overall feel and look of this is fluffy and soft. So we actually want to create areas of colour and light. Now, I'm still thinking about the lay and the length of the fur as I move. I'm not making these markings overly long and I'm making sure that they are following a fur direction, but you can see I'm not as concerned about creating individual fine hairs. We can add details over the top, and I often do this when we get to our lightest lights, and it tends to be enough. But at this stage I still want to build up a fullness, and in doing so we want to retain the depth in between these clumps. So we need to make sure that we retain parts of this underpainting. So semi-blunt pencil, you'll be pleased to know. I love it when I can use semi-blunt pencils because I hate sharpening my pencils. Again, thinking about the lay of the fur, and I'm sweeping that pencil on and off the page so that the markings don't become heavy and we don't see the start and finish of each mark. They just gently appear and disappear. Once more, if you've just dived into this lesson and you're wondering how you create markings that appear and disappear seamlessly, I would definitely go and check out the earlier videos in this series because it walks you through step by step how to start to get to this stage. And we begin just with an ordinary HB pencil. So they're the lessons that I've been referring to. Okay, for the hairs down here, we need to think about the fact that they're now getting longer. And if you remember when we were doing the wavy fur in the last video, I said how we don't want to have continuous markings wiggling all the way down. Well, I'm eating my words. When we're creating markings on cockapoos and cavapoos and all the rest of the poos, you will get areas around the snout and here over the cheek whereby you can actually see pretty continuous curls. Now, they don't go all the way down the face. Do remember about the length of these sections that you're making, but these clumps are not as curly and full as something like a spaniel ear. They are a bit flatter, so we can actually make longer markings, a longer mark and another long mark and another long mark to build up an individual clump. You can see that these do feel flatter than the wavy fur that I showed you how to do in the last lesson. And they feel flatter if you look at them on the face as well. They literally lay against the face. So I'm being really careful to make sure that I do not cover up too much of my underpainting too quickly. I'm thinking about the eye sockets. Have I still got an eye socket structure there? Yes, the eye is appearing out. I want to make some of this a bit darker. It's becoming a bit too light. Very, very easily done. So you can see I'm just leaving all these gaps at the moment. We can return to them, we can adjust the colour, we can adjust the value, but you want to make sure that you leave gaps. Okay, so I'm going to get a bit darker again now and increase this sense of depth by moving to our warms. So when we've got these kinds of colours in the fur, moving into the reds can really help build a sense of depth. So the 670 is lovely to work from the edges of the 620, that orangey colour that I was just using, and glazing gently over them. Some of these are just far too light, so I'm going to glaze over these. It makes them a bit darker, and then I'm lifting my pencil as I get to that underpainting, and you can see that this pencil, this lovely red, just disappears into that underpainting, and I have now an increased sense of depth there. It doesn't feel quite as flat. So I'm just going to go around using this a little bit like a blending tool is one way to think of it, to again ensure that we have soft transitions into that underpainting. If you've retained areas of your underpainting, but you don't have a sensation of depth by the end, then consider whether your edges are soft enough and whether the fur is transitioning into the underpainting nice and gently. If it isn't transitioning into the underpainting gently, then again, you won't have a particularly great sense of depth. So as I'm going into shadows, I'm just glazing this now. Still following the fur direction when I glaze, but a glaze means I'm just very gently shading my pencil over the top of other areas, not with the intent to rub them out, but just to very gently leave a little bit of an impression of this reddish pencil over the top. So it just mixes. So before doing anything else, I'm going to get quite a lot lighter, and this is then going to help me adjust my colours and values in these darker sections. So I'm using the Desert Rose, the 042 from Caran d'Ache, and this is, as I said, this is where we can start to add those individual details a little bit more easily. Now, you won't always need to add individual details for this fur type. Sometimes even in the lit areas, we'd actually just need to shade it on, and you can see how soft and fluffy that does make it feel. So again, try and remember to leave gaps, and I'm working carefully over the tips of these clumps of fur. So I'm not drawing really long sweeping lines with this light pencil. The light is only catching the tips of each hair. So you want these to be actually very, very small markings. Now I'm only drawing obviously a little section of this painting, and a lot of the section that I'm drawing is actually in shadow. So we'll just get a couple of hints of this here and there, mainly coming across the top. Such a lovely pencil to use because it does show up really, really well. I actually don't need to press hard with this at all for it to show up. Caran d'Ache is a very, very soft pencil, softer than Stabilo, I would say. It does depend obviously on the colour that you're using as to how soft it's going to be. And there are pros and cons to that. They are very expensive, so if you're a beginner, you might think, well, if they're really expensive, they must be the best. In terms of the colours, the pigments, yes, they are artist quality, they are fantastic. But in terms of the handling, to be honest, I actually prefer some of my other pastels most of the time. I find these a little bit thick to work with, certainly for smaller drawings, and they can clog up the tooth of the card for my drawing style a little bit too quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to have this lovely light trailing out. See, that gives me a really nice soft edge actually. And that has now really helped me to see the other values and colours which are happening in the rest of the drawing. So I want to go back in with my darkest brown, the 177. You can see I've been really careful to keep these particularly dark shadows that I established at the beginning. Just like I did in the curly fur tutorial, I'm actually being quite light and gently sweep my pencil over these shadows now. It re-establishes them. It also helps me join the fur. Remember, I'm always talking about soft transitions for this type of fur. It helps me join those fur details that I've put on into the underpainting even more softly. This is when I use my pencils as blending tools. I often have people asking about that. I personally do not use blending tools. You absolutely can, they are wonderful. But I really like using my pencils to blend things together. And part of that happens at this stage when we start to re-establish shadows or different colours, and you can glaze over the top. Just want this bit around the eye to get a little bit darker. So I'm sweeping in the fur direction, and I'm thinking about creating a few shadows in between these fur markings, glazing over the top at the same time because it does need to be darker in there. Just picking up the black, just blending out around the eye again. And then picking out a few deep shadows with the black. You can just see a few individual tiny shadows on the reference photo. Now, a lovely technique that I've gone through in other lessons is to tap, and it can help to disperse markings and make them a little bit softer. I'm going to make some of these shadows even darker. I'm always very cautious about using black when I've got colours in the fur, other than just black, because it can kill the colour and it can make things feel a little bit drab. But I'm just being very, very gentle, and it's all possible to see much more easily now I have my lightest lights in, and basically adjusting my levels of contrast. And you've probably guessed it, I'm going to go in with my reddish brown very, very lightly. Use it as a blending tool to gently transition this out. So just increasing that contrast. You could change shapes of the clumps if you want to, just like we did with the fur, the curly fur. Okay, so now just to re-establish some of those details. So I often say it's a backwards and forwards process where we put some put some colour in with one pencil, we remove a little bit or adjust the edge, and then we go back in again until we get a nice balance, a bit of a Goldilocks situation until it's just right. So again, working on these clumps, these quite long strands that come down from underneath the eye socket, they are quite flat in the way that they lay over the face, but at the same time, they're not perfectly straight. So do just make sure that you get some sort of curve into them. Otherwise, they could flatten the actual face. And again, we need to remember that there is a sense of depth here. We are telling a story that there is a structure underneath this fur. So I'm leaving plenty of the underpainting. Pop some delicate small details over the edge from the snout. And then the brow. So for the brow, it is thicker. There is less depth in this particular strand of fur, this big clump coming out here. It's quite just a large section, but it does disappear into a shadow. And then we have another section of fur tumbling over the top of it. So look how I've changed the fur direction to describe that. Describe how it's falling over the top of another bit. Okay, and then onto the pink. So this is the 132 from Faber Castell. So it's a darker pink than the Desert Rose, you can see. I'm not putting a lot of pressure through it, but it's just allowing me to lift the value slightly in a few areas because we do have some ivory hairs, but they're in shadow. So I'm not putting them in with an ivory, I'm putting them in with a pink. They feel like ivory hairs, but they're not too light. And because it's pink, again, it's just helping me modulate my colours and prevent everything becoming a bit too orange as I work. As always, you can tap on top of hairs with a clean finger if they stand out a bit too much, and that can be really useful. You just add a slight bit of fullness to these curves, particularly around here. This would be about the edge of the orbit of the eye, so it'd be quite a good place to just catch a little bit of light and just show that they're tumbling over the top of a skeletal structure. Just re-establishing this shadow. As I said at the beginning, the eye socket is so important. That is an area in a portrait where you want a really good amount of depth. So I would quite happily continue fiddling with this, I think, to my heart's content, just adding more of the warm sort of red purples around the base of some of the tufts of fur to increase this sense of depth. If I was working on the whole portrait, I would probably end up working with a spectrum of purples in the shadows, and then as I get into the lighter values, I would really ramp up a coral colour, particularly around the other eye. If you look at the reference photo in the workbook, there is a workbook to download with this. You can see a lot of luminosity around here on the other eye, and to balance out the purples in the shadows, some really intense corally oranges would work beautifully there. So obviously we're just working on a small section, so the colours and everything end up looking a little bit strange because this area is in shadow, but what we're focused on is trying to create a sense of depth, and it's all about leaving areas of the underpainting available right to the very end and not covering everything up, which is really quite tricky to do because we just want to make everything feel finished, but by doing that you will actually flatten your work and you can't really pull it back if you end up covering the tooth of the card too much. So here I am, I'm unable to leave my work alone and not fiddle with it. Right, I must put pencils down. So to recap, we have various different textures happening in here in terms of this quite fine fur around the snout. We've got short tufts happening, longer strands, and these, as I said, they're almost flat, but look how I added just a slight little bit of lighter value running along where we would get the turn into the cheek, and that has just lifted it and allowed this eye to sit back into the eye socket as it needs to. I've retained some really deep shadows in between the tufts of the fur. This would all make a lot more sense if it was a full pet portrait, of course, but I will put an image up on screen of how this technique works up on a very similar pet portrait. And as I said, there is actually a full-length voiceover time-lapse of this in the membership area. So if you want to just watch me draw and see how I use this, then that's a really good one to have a look at, just to see how it all comes together over an entire drawing. I really hope you found this useful. This technique can be applied to lots of different breeds of dog and is a really great one to have in your list of techniques. Should help you build your confidence if you're becoming a pet portrait artist, to be able to create these realistic, soft but full textures.